Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our first One Health seminar of the spring 2021. Welcome back, all of you who have been at a number of our One Health seminars in the past. And for those of you who are new, let me just tell you a little bit about One Health. So One Health is kind of the transdisciplinary approach, a systems approach, looking at the connectivity and recognizing the connectivity between people in our society, plants and animals, and the environment, and that there are interactions that go both ways. It can be either positive or negative interactions. And One Health at DelVal is seeking to really engage all of our students, all of our majors, in recognizing this opportunity to really work outside your own discipline with other people to address some of the serious issues that are affecting not only globally, but nationally, regionally, and even in our local communities. So we have a variety of presentations that we bring forward, trying to really hit on the different majors that we hear at DelVal. There are three major perspectives we take on this. We look at it from the standpoint of education. So faculty members at DelVal, many of them incorporate the concept of One Health into their courses. Also, we're encouraging research in which you try to bring multiple disciplines to bear on particular issues. And then finally, outreach. And that's what the seminars are all about, is an outreach to all of our students on campus, but also outreach to all of you folks in the community, which I hope there are several of you on today. My apologies for my light just flickering. I have a cat who is trying to assist me with this seminar, and it's kind of going a little bit awry at the moment. Hopefully they won't turn me off altogether. At this point, I'd like to point out that we have two excellent speakers this evening. We've got Dr. Brian Lutz, and we have Dr. Jessica McCall. And they're our very own DelVal faculty members and folks that I got to say that I've really missed. The pandemic has kept us away from the lunchroom, and I really miss the conversations that we've had. And I think tonight you're probably going to get a taste of how some of these conversations go. So, woo, at this point, I will turn it over to Dr. Lutz. Take it away. And remember, if you have questions, you can put those in the Q&A at the bottom of the page. And at the end of the presentations, we will come back and address all of your questions. Thanks. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks, Reg, and thanks for having us. Our presentation is called Viral Communications, but I'm a Beastie Boys fan, so my version of it is going to be called Ill Communication. I'm going to speak for a little while, and then Jess is going to take over, and we're going to try to make it more or less one sort of conversation that we're having about communication and its successes and failures. So you're going to forgive me. I wrote it down. You're going to forgive me because I don't see you and I can't hear you, so you don't have a choice but to do that. But we'll. I'm gonna read what I wrote, and then Jess will read her better presentation, and then you guys can certainly ask some questions, and we'll be happy to answer them. So this is ill communication. Language owes no allegiance. It bends a knee to fact and fiction with equal fervor. It's mercenary, working for whomever is willing to pay the cost of labor. It does not care if it's in the service of memoir or perjury, papal bull or bullshit. The adulterer and the scientist use the same language to make their case, neither with a higher guarantee of success. There is, in other words, no special code tangled in the verbs and nouns to alert your audience that what they're about to hear is the truth. We are sick with lies. Our immune system is overrun. But what you're about to hear is the truth. At the age of 94, in the year 2020, Sir David Attenborough joined Instagram. In 4 hours and 44 minutes, he had over 1 million followers, breaking a world record. In his first post, he writes, I am making this move because, as we all know, the world is in trouble. Continents are on fire. Glaciers are melting. Coral reefs are dying. The list goes on and on. Perhaps more importantly, though, his frequent collaborators, Johnny Hughes and Colin Butfield, who helped him manage the account, wrote on his behalf, "Saving our planet is now a communication challenge. We know what to do, we just need the will." While the power of Attenborough's foray into new media is somewhat undercut by the fact that 2 months after he burst onto the world of Instagram, he let his account go fallow, the fact remains that Attenborough and his collaborators were right. Saving our planet is a communications challenge, a challenge complicated by the function of belief, the roles of our personal invisible ideologies, and the promise made by social media that our voices and opinions, no matter how inexpert, should and need to be heard. There is a consensus on global climate change by the people whose consensus matters most, climate scientists. Multiple studies published in peer-reviewed scientific journals show that 97% or more of actively publishing climate scientists agree. Climate warming trends over the past century are extremely likely due to human activities. In addition, most of the leading scientific organizations worldwide have issued public statements endorsing this position. Among the American groups that agree are NASA, NOAA, the Hadley Center, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Chemical Society, the American Meteorological Society, and on and on and on. Yet, according to the Pew Research Center, only about half of Americans, 49%, say that human activity contributes a great deal to climate change. Another 30% say human activity plays not too much or no role at all in climate change. To put this in perspective, a statistically equivalent number of Americans, about 45%, according to a YouGov poll, believe ghosts are real. The problem isn't proof or scientific evidence or consensus of expertise. The problem is communication. The 21st century doesn't suffer from the dearth of knowledge. It suffers because it doesn't know what to do with its supersaturation of knowledge. On December 30th, 2020, at the end of a truly terrifying year, made all the more terrible by the doling out of misleading, false, and dangerous information, NPR published an article on how this country has organized its beliefs. A poll conducted at the end of the year brought to light the fact that approximately 40% of Americans believe COVID-19 was manufactured in a lab in China. It was not. 1/3 of Americans believe voter fraud helped elect Joe Biden. It did not. By the 6th of January 2021, a portion of the misinformed turned terrorists and attacked the Capitol on the word of a renowned liar, in spite of no evidence, in spite of certification of the vote by the majority of members of their own party. I'll be honest. When I started thinking about this presentation, this speech in November, I imagined I would speak about why so many people don't believe in science. I thought I would talk about communication as a necessary aspect of our communal well-being. I thought I would point out the gaps in what we can prove to be true and what we believe, the vacuum between what we know and how we communicate it, and how we learn to understand what is communicated to us. But I realized to overlook unhealthy communication in other fields is to miss the point of One Health. It would be me sanitizing the truth to avoid conflict. And that's one of the ways communication fails. This year, this country elected a person to Congress who has publicly supported the idea that school shootings are hoaxes, has toyed with on social media the idea that a Jewish law firm has redirected the sun's energy to start wildfires in California, in spite of the fact that we know these fires are amplified in part by global climate change. We are beset with misinformation. It is viral and it is in our bloodstream. To look at only one source of ill communication and to ignore all others is to fail in the primary goal of One Health, to improve the well-being of all life on the planet. It's also to diagnose the disease without looking at all the symptoms. So let's look. Why do we continue to believe what we cannot prove? It's tempting to think that stupidity is the answer. That is, that people who believe these conspiracies are simply dumb or uninformed. That people who deny science are ignorant, have willfully buried their heads in the sand, but that's not the case. And even if it were, that's not helpful. A better answer is that we have forgotten that communication is as essential to our overall well-being as science, if in sometimes stunningly different ways. A better answer is that we are all susceptible to the lure of theories that buoy our into ideologies, even when we can't always see our ideologies for what they are. A system of reduction used to help us map out our complicated lives in the age of information. The fact is, I'm not going to have time to highlight all that we need to know to hear information for what it is: codified data reproduced in slick packaging. The 20th century philosopher Walter Benjamin put it like this: there is no event or thing in either animate or inanimate nature that does not in some way partake of language. And while he may be overstating the case here, it's not by much. He goes on to tell us that language is expressive and creative and not exact, and thus our acts of interpretation, our ways of understanding human knowledge, are flawed, are sick. Language is a tool for reduction. It's a process of reducing the world's data into manageable information. For example, the human eye can distinguish millions of shades of color, millions. But no language has words for more than 1,000 of these, even with compounds and metaphors like watermelon red or midnight blue. So we reduce, we interpret. We do this to understand, to make sense of the myriad world. It's necessary, but it's incomplete. We need to understand our world, but we also need to understand the system of transmission in order to understand what it is we are trying to transmit. Otherwise, we might all be susceptible to flawed conspiracies. We might all fall prey to the beliefs that sound good because they are constructed with linguistic legerdemain. I have heard people say science doesn't care about what you believe. And as satisfying as that statement is to me, it so far misses the point as to be inane. It's true, the world is getting warmer, and no amount of disbelief from the population is going to change that. It's equally true that 9/11 was not a government conspiracy, that school shootings aren't staged to take away people's guns. But the facts are the only part of the equation. We are not dispassionate watchers from some distant planet verifying our hypotheses. We intend change. We want to stop the headlong tumble into the fires of hell that run on fossil fuels, fascism, and white supremacy. Of course, your science requires our belief. That's how it gets funded. That's how it changes the world. That's how it's been biased in the past and prejudiced and troubled since its inception. Science might be the best system we have for understanding the madness of the world, but it doesn't lead revolutions. It doesn't convince populations. It doesn't by itself save the world. That's why an 18-year-old woman from Sweden has had more success in raising awareness on climate change than many scientists and journalists. Love that fact or hate it, it is a fact that tells us that communication is as much a part of the solution to our woes as it is the culprit of them. So let's take a second here to dive shallowly into what exactly communication is and how we might begin the process of doing it better. Acknowledging right now in the process that what I have just said may piss off some of you. I may have said things that confront your beliefs, that insult your understanding of the world. But after all, that's the point. We allow ourselves to be blocked from the truth by the manner of its delivery. I'm not insisting on my own truth here. I'm saying, regardless of that, we will block it if it doesn't come in the form we like. Perhaps the easiest entry then to understand the complexity of this communication is through a field of study called discourse analysis. In short, and obviously, practitioners explore how discourse works. That begs the question, what is discourse? For an answer here, I'm going to turn to Rodney Jones. In his text, aptly named Discourse Analysis, Jones points out that while discourse analysis got its start in linguistics, the field is not just the study of language. It's a way of looking at language and really all communication that focuses on how people use real life, how people use it in real life. The way of looking at language, this is a way of looking at language based on four major assumptions. They're fairly obvious, so bear with me for a second as I put them up. Language is ambiguous. What things mean is never absolutely clear. All communication involves interpreting what other people mean, what they are trying to do. Think about how we might say, "Do you have a pen?" as a statement meaning, "May I borrow a pen?" Language is always in the world. That is, what language means is always a matter of where and when it is used and what it is used to do. Language is always situated in at least four ways. Language is situated in the material world, where we encounter it. It will contribute to the way we interpret it. Language is situated within relationships. One of the main ways we understand what people mean when they speak or write is by referring to who they are, how well we know them, and whether or not they have some kind of power over us. These identities, I might add, are not required to be real, nor is the power of that identity. Seeming real can do just as much harm or just as much good. Feeling like you know someone can change how we listen and hear and read. Feeling like someone is too different from you can do the same thing. Language is situated in history. That is, in relation to what has happened before and what is expected to happen afterward. Think of phrases like Black Lives Matter. Finally, language is situated in relation to other language. Utterances and text always respond to or refer to other utterances and texts. That is, everything that we say or write is situated in a kind of web of discourse. 3. The way we use language is inseparable from who we are and the different social groups to which we belong. We use language to display different kinds of social identities and to show that we belong to different groups. Language is never used all by itself. It is always combined with other things, such as our tone of voice, our facial expressions, and gestures when we speak, the fonts, layouts, and graphics we use in written text and presentations. What language means and what we can do with it is often a matter of how it is combined with other things. As Marshall McLuhan said decades ago, the medium is the message. Consider that a Twitter rant might be called nothing more than a paragraph somewhere else, that a series of text messages or DMs might seem to boil with or lack excitement in that medium, but if spoken or if written in a novel, may have a different message altogether. This is discourse, and it's dangerous. What I consider eloquent prose, you might think of as word vomit or the babble of a simpleton, because the way we use language is inseparable from who we are and the different social groups to which we belong. We are, in other words, creating not just a sentence, but ourselves when we communicate. And we tend to produce ourselves within the confines of in groups and out groups. That is, we create ourselves not as rugged individuals, but as members of groups we want to belong to. Sometimes, ironically, a group that identifies itself as rugged individuals. Because language is situated within relationships, we tend to understand people in our groups better than we understand people outside of these groups. That helps us, or sometimes appears to help us anyway, navigate the ambiguity of language. I understand you better because you are making yourself like me as I make myself like you. And because language is situated in history, socioeconomic, and political history, we often end up understanding like minded people and reproducing ourselves as members of those groups where we feel like we belong, even if we are able at times to code switch. The media calls this the echo chamber, but I prefer the term feedback loop. Psychologist and skeptic Michael Shermer defines feedback loop as a social system like witch crazes from the 16th and 17th centuries. These social systems self-organize through feedback loops in which outputs are connected to inputs, producing change in response to both, like a public address system with feedback or stock market booms and busts driven by flurries of buying and selling, if you can imagine such a thing. The underlying mechanism, he continues, driving witch craze is the cycle of information through a closed system. This cycling is obviously dangerous. It produces people who can't believe in climate science, but who can believe wholeheartedly that democratic leaders are part of a cult of Satan worshiping baby eaters. But beyond being dangerous, it is to some degree to be expected. While speaking to people of like mind may help us understand one another's meaning, it does not help us situate those meanings in the truth. Language, as I said from the onset, doesn't owe allegiance to truth or lies. It's not separable from the world, nor it is not separate from the world, nor from who we are. It is capable of deception as it is detection. And as long as we treat it as a thing we understand because it is a thing we use and need to use, we will be fooled by it as often as we are amazed by it. It will keep us collectively in the dark as much as it will illuminate a way to better understanding. Unchecked and unstudied, language is pandemic as much as it is panacea. This, what I've talked about tonight, what we're going to talk about tonight, is a truth we all implicitly know. It's the reason that Reg puts on these events. It's the reason most of us who teach on some level to get at the truth where it hides and bring it into the light of day. But we need to do more than stave the hemorrhaging of truthful information. Our health and well-being of the planet and the well-being of the planet and its people is insistent on a shared education, learning science and how to communicate it, learning solutions and how to explain those conclusions, learning not just to speak what we think into the closed loop of our tight social networks, but to read against these comforting manacles and challenge the ease of their understanding with the rigor we have applied to climate science. We need one health. We need the end of the nonsense of soft and hard skills. We need to acknowledge the shared responsibilities of our disciplines to create and distribute the only vaccine capable of dealing with viral communication, the hard work of communicating the truth. But how do we do that? How do we get better at this? How can we bind the truth to the word? Luckily, I don't have to cover that part. Jess is going to is going to introduce us to some of the ways we can get better at the practice and the process of communication. So thanks for listening to me. And now Jess is going to take over and do her more interesting thing.
Let's not oversell it. Are you going to work? So I've got some actionable options, and I also am going to spend a minute talking about how we can be mindful of our relationship to language and its effect on us. So for my part, I want to start with a meme I recently saw. It read, "Liberals want you to think like them. Conservatives just want you to think." What's particularly apt about this meme is that it's malleable. First, we might flip it. Conservatives want you to think like them. Liberals just want you to think. Or we might channel the 16th century and say, Catholics want you to think like them. Protestants just want you to think. There's no actual meaning to this or any other meme, and it demonstrates the fundamental uncertainty of language. This is why diametrically opposed beliefs can read 1984 and believe with absolute certainty that the other side is Big Brother. We are always the Winstons, the V's, or the Captain Americas. And until we recognize how our desire to be the hero, to be right, affects our relationship to knowledge and language, we can never engage with rational thinking effectively. In A History of Modern Fact by Mary Poovey, she traces how the fact became modernity's most favored unit of knowledge. As Poovey explains, over the course of writing the book, she discovered the story of how description came to seem separate from interpretation or theoretical analysis. The story of how one kind of representation, numbers, came to seem immune from theory or interpretation. What Poovey and other researchers have unveiled is the process by which humans have equated precision, memorization, and ultimately certainty with knowledge. And because we fundamentally misunderstand numbers and what they represent, numbers equal precise. Math is math, after all. But that's not how knowledge works. And our failure to deal with the complexities of belief and the subjectivity of language has left us vulnerable to those who would use it to manipulate us. The function of belief, whether it's the belief that the earth is round or the belief that an all-powerful being created the universe and all life within it, is the same. And we have, generally speaking, confused the feeling of making meaning, reading a meme and saying, yeah, it's those other people who are brainwashing communists, with actually knowing something, like the history of communism and how it operates as an economic system versus the dictatorships that are often leveled in order to stifle inquiry and make those asking uncomfortable questions about economics seem like the enemy, just as an example. Meaning making is what allows knowledge generation. It's what turns sounds into words and images into texts. And because meaning making is a powerful moment and one that is most often experienced as knowing, like the phrase, "I knew it down to my bones" implies, we have begun to equate the notion of truth with the sensation of knowing. Because of this sensation, if you present me with an argument and I do not experience this moment of knowing, then what you're saying must not be true. If it were true, it would be undeniable, it would be certain, it would be obvious, it would be a fact. But that's not actually what it means to know things, at least not in any sort of rational critical capacity. To be rational is to first admit that we are always, first and foremost, irrational. To engage with information critically is to acknowledge that there is no such thing as objective, and pretending there is merely obscures the power dynamics driving a particular exchange. Ah, but what about gravity, I hear you saying, and fair enough. So let me rephrase. Do things exist outside of our subjectivity? Absolutely. Does anything mean anything outside of our subjectivity? Absolutely not. Knowledge, like all aspects of life, is interconnected. So if we want to be critical thinkers, then we must do more than repress and dismiss the subjective. We must do the hard work of understanding ourselves so that we do not continue to misunderstand others. Subjectivity bias, worries about brainwashing, calling other people sheeple, it all stems from the same place. To know a thing is to constantly revise what you think about a thing. To be a critical thinker is to commit yourself to humility and accepting your vulnerability. And we do not like how that makes us feel. We gravitate to the pithy memes and the fake news because it makes us feel good. We feel right. We feel certain. We feel like we have purpose. And this is why understanding ourselves and our emotions is such a necessary part of understanding knowledge and interpreting data. For example, imagine if we could just admit that our concerns regarding climate change stem from fears of lost jobs, poverty, or worse, that the idea of the world becoming uninhabitable is simply too much. I've got student loans to pay. I do not have the emotional bandwidth for that kind of anxiety. Imagine if we could admit that we like guns and shooting things and blowing things up because it's fun, but also because it makes us feel powerful. It makes us feel invulnerable. Imagine if we were honest that sometimes not understanding what someone is saying or the research they're presenting makes us feel inadequate, talked down to, and less than. And if we could admit those things, then we could stop debating whether the conversations need to happen. The world is literally burning. We just accept school shooter drills as a part of life. And we are so incapable of self-assessment that school board members of Bucks County feel threatened by teachers discussing race and racism. The conversations need to happen. So what should be debated is not whether these topics are real, but what, if anything, we should do about them. Our emotions and what we know and how we know it and what we think any of that means is all connected. Our emotions drive our interpretation of data, which is filtered through our self-image, which shapes how we make meaning out of language, which coalesces in a belief that something is true or not true. This happens subconsciously for almost all of us, and when the process is pointed out as a skill which can be practiced, adapted, and refined, our response entirely too often is to simply scream fake news. There are things inside of us we do not want to think about and beliefs we do not want to question. That's pretty aggressive, so I want us to pause for a moment and take stock of what we're feeling. Notice I haven't offered any answers yet. Notice I haven't made any claims about policy or morality or what people should conclude. The only things I have discussed so far are a series of observable patterns backed up by research undertaken across a swath of disciplines that clearly indicates humanity's favorite pastime is feeling right. So now we can talk about what we want to do about it. People in very important meetings love the term actionable items. First of all, we can be nicer to ourselves. There are good evolutionary reasons for why we are the way we are. Self-serving bias, the function of believing we are better than we are, smarter, more right, more worthy, staves off depression and allows us to proceed when all hope is lost. And bias in general is normal. As Gerard Smallberg states, our brains evolved having to make the best guess with limited information. Bias enables us to make meaning out of the chaos, to pick a place to begin, to know, there's that word again, to know when the other side is dangerous. Bias is not bad, evil, or immoral, though it can be used in the service of all of those things. Bias simply is. When there is observable evidence of a specific conclusion, then yes, I am biased towards that conclusion. It would be irrational to be anything else. And when I learn something, my thoughts are changed by what I learned. Is that indoctrination? Well, it's me accepting a piece of information as true that came from someone else, and that means I might be wrong. That means I might be lied to. That means I might be manipulated. It also means my fear of being manipulated might drive me to deny observable reality. So what can one do? I suggest cultivating the ability to think about your thinking. How are we arriving at our conclusions? Why are we interpreting language to mean in particular ways? Who are we trusting, not trusting, and why? Am I scared, anxious, uncertain? And if so, why? Is it more likely, we might ask ourselves, that the entire world is engaged in a global conspiracy to lie to us about the shape of the earth, and I and a select few of other independent thinkers on the internet have ferreted out the actual truth? Or is it more likely that it makes me feel good to feel special? This doesn't rule out the possibility of the global conspiracy, but it does mean that I really need to sit with the possibility of being wrong. Is it more likely that climate scientists and environmentalists are wrong about the causes of our changing ecosystems? Or is it more likely that those with billions invested in the various industries which must be altered in order to address these issues have used propaganda and manipulated information in order to protect their interests and preserve their wealth? And again, I'm offering no answers. What should be done about these problems, how we should solve them, the most ethical options moving forward are all above my pay grade. But I know that interpretation is a powerful act, and our refusal to be honest about what it is and how we engage with it leaves us vulnerable to those with a vested interest in controlling truth. I also know that when we scream, "That's biased" at each other, or "You didn't consider both sides," What we're actually doing is dismissing arguments rather than engaging with them. And I know that we can talk ourselves into believing anything if we try hard enough, and that is terrifying. But living with the discomfort of uncertain language and thus uncertain knowledge, without letting it drive us to extreme reactions of fear, panic, and a need to reassert control, is the foundation of critical thinking. You can't just label something biased and opinion and demand facts because you aren't convinced. You have to be able to explain why you're not convinced and demonstrate awareness of the evidence and where, when, and how it fails. So instead of saying both sides, consider saying multifaceted. There are not two sides to everything, but every topic has multiple perspectives. Instead of saying I'm right and you're wrong, we can learn to see what the other person sees and imagine how their logic came to be. And instead of asserting bias and fake news at topics which challenge our beliefs, our sense of self, and our safety, we can be courageous enough to admit that if a lot of people studying a thing say it's real, probably us and our YouTube videos are the ones struggling to admit there's something rotten in the state of Denmark. And instead of calling ourselves critical thinkers and other people sheeple, we can admit that all humans are big bags of emotional anxiety just trying to survive with a brain that still gets distracted by shiny things. Being right feels good. Being accepted feels good. Feeling like we know more, are more, have more than others feels good. But language is a lot like drugs. The right kind can unlock your universe, but unwary users end up convinced that war is peace, freedom is slavery, and forget that George Orwell was a socialist. So that is the end of my presentation as well. And we can now move to answering questions for the Q&A. And we invite people to please share their thoughts. This whole presentation is about dealing with our thoughts and our information honestly and being willing to have conversation rather than run from it.
So there is one question down in Q&A. I don't know if you can see that, Jess.
I can.
A couple of questions.
That's good. The reason I'm not sure that I follow.
So I think what the comment is suggesting is that everybody wants the rest of the world to see their point of view and to be convinced that they're right and that they are the free thinkers and that everybody else is somehow manipulated. If I'm getting that wrong, please just kind of put something in the Q&A there to correct me. I don't think that I think that's a pretty strong statement. I think that that's true. I think a lot of people want to feel like free thinkers. Part of what we want to ask again is how language functions and works there. Jess confronted the idea of what critical thinking means, but we want to again return to the idea of how language itself functions, which is to say, free thinking is given this position of authority. It's better than other kinds of thinking. But I'm curious as to what everybody would say are the other kinds of thinking. They would probably, as Jess pointed out, call other people sheeple, somehow not free to think. But I don't think anybody believes that they don't think what they want to think. That doesn't tend to be how we respond. What it is a way to code our language to suggest that we are more free. And since Americans value freedom at such a high price, and we can talk about that in different ways, but since we do that, it gains within this world, it gains value as a tool to use to talk. In other words, if I say this is a free thing in some way, free thought, free speech, free whatever, it's automatically better, but we don't analyze and ask the question, was it actually any of those things? And so that's where we have to be careful where the language we're using isn't, as Jess pointed out with her first meme, just reversible. I'm the free thinker, you're the sheeple. No, you're the free thinker and I'm the sheeple. There's nothing tied to it, no evidence, no argument, no breaking down the language to look at how it functions. And so it could go either way. I'm not sure that answered the question, but that's how I read it.
And I think to build off that and go into the second question as well, that's why I've started to focus so strongly on
Would you read that second question, because not
Yes.
everybody can see the question.
Okay. So the second question, do you think that the media is cause for extra anxiety, especially in the case of COVID? So the role that our self-image and our emotions plays, this is where being aware of other people's logic is so important, because people don't imagine they haven't thought things through, as Brian said. And so if I want to understand what you're saying and why, to some degree, I need to understand how you're thinking. And if I can do that in turn, not only does it help get me out of the feedback loop, but it also gives me your perspective to critique my own with, and vice versa. So to that, into the COVID question, yes and no, because 24-hour news cycle means, and I don't know how everyone else dealt with this, but for a while my phone would buzz with alerts, and at some point I kind of had to shut it off because I couldn't deal with another breaking news alert that something was going on. And so when you're just constantly getting hit with news, but no context, no conversation, no explanation, that's going to amp up your anxiety significantly. Now, if what we mean there is, did the media unnecessarily cause extra anxiety? And this is where we want to pay attention to that language, right? Do I mean the anxiety that was caused was too much, was unfair, was poor representation, or was a true representation but needed to happen with more explanation, right? All of that is implied in the question of, is the media a cause for extra anxiety? And so what we might do there is try to break that down and think through, which way do we want to approach that question?
I'd like to bring up a question here. So within the area of conservation biology, we're very much dependent upon involving stakeholders in addressing particular problems. And one of the things that people have been more and more kind of trained to is to stay away from particular language or words. So not to immediately feel that some stakeholders are alienated from what you're talking about, and they automatically kind of put the brakes on and go, no, I don't want to discuss this anymore. I've even seen some people speaking on the news, and I've kind of been listening to them and going, hey, this person's making a lot of sense. But then I find out when they identify who the person is, I go, oh, that's one of them. So somebody, and I immediately go, oh, okay, well, I'm not so sure this is real. And this person is disguising themselves as being one of my group, whatever that group might be. Is there a danger in trying to avoid or trying to disguise yourself, I guess? You know, Brian was talking about being part of one group or another group, and you want to identify with that group. If you use language, whether it's physical language as well, to kind of get your message across, is there a potential for you to be seen as a fraud, a fake, a, you know, somebody who's trying to get behind the scenes to attack from within?
So the short answer to that is yes. The long and more complicated answer, which is the kind I like to give, is that so language, as I was trying to suggest on some levels, is based within history. So we get taught which language to use in certain situations and which language to avoid in certain situations. And the reason for that is so that we can slip in and out of groups. There is a goal for this sort of offense neutral language, right? All the words I'm using are going to come across as safe, as sanitized, and easy for digestion, right? This is one way we can reach other people. However, as you also pointed out, Reg, as soon as we realize what group the people are in, we do have a tendency to do the same thing that we did before, resist what the message is, whether or not we actually agree with the message, right? The danger, though, of making that kind of simple language, or not simple, but because it's never simple, it's what Hemingway said, easy reading is damn hard writing. But what the danger of that is that it gets so sanitized as to be like a flavorless wafer, right? It's a thing that, like, yeah, it might fill your stomach, but it doesn't do much else. So it doesn't evoke excitement if you're trying to get people on board. It doesn't challenge anything. So it just becomes background noise, white noise that we can kind of avoid and not pay attention to. And people who are trained in how to, and people who aren't, because it's not always about training, but people who are trained in how to read language and people who are good at kind of detecting what goes on in language will immediately pick up on that sort of vanillaizing, it's a word I'm coining right now, of language, and recognize it as trying to avoid conflict, right? And there's nothing wrong with trying to avoid conflict, but what we have a tendency to do, and I think Jess is probably far better of an expert on this than I am, but what we have a tendency to do is we try to avoid conflict so much that when we are confronted with conflict, we are already primed for explosion because we're not doing what she said before and having these conversations all along. I'm not sure if I answered your question, Reg, because in spite of being here talking about communication, I mean, I don't know, maybe I didn't do a great job on it, but
no, that's fine. I'd love to hear Jess's take on this too. And then we do have several more questions that have come up in Q&A. So I don't want to keep you all on my question, but Jess, do you have anything to add?
Well, I do want to say there's a reason that Plato wanted to kick out all the writers and the poets, right? Because language, when used well, gives us that beautiful aha moment where we feel understood, where we feel like we're seen, where we feel like we can communicate ourselves. But also when someone wants to use it against us, it's such a powerful weapon. And that's why I think you can't, or you shouldn't just teach language. You should teach language in combination with ethics, philosophy. You should teach language in combination with science, right? Because all of these knowledges live together. And if I understand consequence of my rhetoric, the consequence of making myself seem appealing, or the consequence of trying to persuade you in a particular way, then if I'm committed to being ethical, of course, then I have yet another opportunity to make sure I'm using that rhetoric for a goal that we're both working towards, rather than trying to manipulate. Even though persuasion is a form of manipulation, I'm not trying to trick you. I'm just trying to help us meet somewhere in terms of our perspectives. So the next question, oh, thank you. Next question. This makes me think about the phrase common sense. Can we then debunk that common sense is not really common? We sure can, because common sense is, like all cliches, we use it as a shortcut, right? But what it actually means is, in my experience, this is a thing I take for granted, or this is a thing I learned in such a way I never considered where or how I learned it. But what that actually does when it intersects with power is allows me to say, how could you not know that? That's so, and then like fill in your derogatory comment about someone's intelligence. And we don't always mean it in a mean way, but it's a good example of why we want to be mindful of what we take for granted and what we assume truth to be, as opposed to questioning what we know and why we know it, and giving people some thought when they don't know a thing for whatever reason we assumed they should.
Also, I think worth adding there that anything we deem common or normal, language and positions aren't neutral. They got to common and normal in very clear historical ways through what Jess was just talking about, this structure, these structures of power. What is normal tends to be whatever the leading group is suggesting is the way to behave. What is common is also that. Now, it's not a direct sort of command and response system. It's just the practice of the people in power doing the same thing they typically do over and over again until it seems normal, right? And so words like common and normal, we use them all the time to assert that we are part of the group in power and authority.
Next question. If so much of the population embraces memes and incomplete arguments to feel right as a means to stave off depression, how do we think about our thinking without spiraling? Communication, nature hikes, positive material action. This is a great question. And a follow-up to that. And if people who aim to control truth are so successful and so powerful in doing so, how do we refuse that power grab? So I love the phrase existential o'clock or existential crisis o'clock, because about 11 or 12 at night, if I think too hard about the nature of the universe and the part where we now think we can detect there was a universe before our universe had a big bang, and then I just spiral. But yes, going for walks, there's a lot of research that shows things like getting out in the open air and exercising helps in those moments. Also, being kind with yourself. So when we think about our thinking and we don't feel in control, learning to sit with that and not fighting it, right? Being like, here's the thing I don't know, or here's the thing I can't understand yet. And that's okay. And that can help stop the pressure. It won't necessarily stop the anxiety, but it can stop that pressure that makes you feel like you're losing awareness. And once you stop the pressure, it becomes a lot easier, I would argue, to find baby steps. What is one thing I could look up? What is one thing I could work to understand? And rather than trying to tackle, the whole big problem, so what's one part of this that interests me that I could research more or read about, and then from there, over time, see what else I might branch out to do?
So the next question, I'll just go on because I think that answer was complete and I don't have anything to add to it. The next question is the reason why false stories become so common because they don't take the time to do research for true stories? Yes, I mean, to some degree that's true, but it's worth noting that because of the amount of information out there, it is impossible for us to do the research on everything, right? There is a struggle going on right now from social media, whether they should ban people who present false information and who gets to determine what that false information is and why. It's a part of regulating how information gets to us and what we should do about it. In the past, we had regulatory agencies that would tell us what news was acceptable. And some of that was good. It would tell us you have to meet certain standards of truth. But other portions of it were bad, what you could report on and how you could talk about things regarding the state or race or violence was all very tightly controlled. Sex and sexuality, you could not mention homosexuality at all in the media. It failed a series of laws that were kind of put forward. So yes, researching is a good thing and you should absolutely do it. There are two problems with that. One, not everybody is going to believe your research. And two, you can't do all of it, as I was suggesting there. There's so much information coming to us at any given time that is difficult to do it all. This isn't me meaning to suggest there are no solutions to things. It is to do what Jess had just said in the previous question, to take small things, focus on those things that we can think about and research them, and then advocate where possible for things like defining in social media what truth is, right? And that's a long and hard conversation that can't be easily answered. Who is being censored and who is not being censored? Those are questions that we have to think about. Free speech is a complicated issue, but we have to start thinking about it. Otherwise, any bit of information is as valuable as any other bit of information because we can code it all and use it in very specific ways. Let me talk real quickly about what that coding looks like. It looks like this screen right now. Jess and I are standing directly facing the camera, our faces facing the camera. This is not how a movie would be made. This is how a news broadcast is made. It's designed to make you feel comfortable with what we're saying. We're telling you the truth. Look at the honesty on our faces. That's how we begin to set up these things. So there are all kinds of tricks that we use to make things seem like the truth. And that means we have to do really hard research, right? And people do. But it also means don't accept everything you read. And anytime you get in, one of my favorite tactics of late is when I get in an argument with typically my family, is to say, let's continue this argument, but we'll both take out our phones. And every time we make a point, we'll just look it up to make sure we're right. And then they don't want to do that anymore. But that's how, that's one way we can kind of go about it. And we make changes small and local as much as we make them large and global.
Okay, next comment. I do, because I don't feel like I answered the second part previously. And if people who aim to control truth are so successful and so powerful in doing so, how do we refuse that power grab? I just want to speak directly to that real fast and say, education, which seems like a terrible answer, but I'm a teacher and that's always my answer. But the more awareness we have individually, the better we are at making choices with awareness of how things operate as a whole. So first of all, we're never going to have enough power to control the world, right? Only supervillains want to. And so you accept that your ability to refuse that power grab is always going to be limited and negotiated. But secondly, I can work to control my own truth. Other debates would be, do we even have free will? But that's like a 3-hour whole conversation. So assuming we have free will, then I can work to control my own truth through education, through research techniques, through remaining flexible and questioning myself. And I don't think that's nothing. I think it does a lot. So Jess, you said in your essay that we're so afraid of being manipulated that we close ourselves off to objectionable truth. I'm wondering what the source of that fear of being manipulated or influenced by others is. Is that a trust thing? I will not trust others when their truth feels like it's attacking me or my identity. At what point is over-identification with a cause or belief preventing us from considering other information for fear of it destroying an individual's identity? If what is known is being equated mistakenly with safety, how do we create space safe enough to welcome uncertainty and admitting that sometimes we just don't know, and that's okay too, rather than shaming people for not knowing? So let's chunk that down. I'm wondering what the source of the fear of being manipulated or influenced by others is. Is it a trust thing? Always, partly it's a trust thing, right? This is ethos that Aristotle talks about. Do I feel like I'm getting a verified source? And one thing we see on social media is, let's say we're friends on Facebook. I post a thing, you trust me, so you share it. But I didn't do my fact checking, so now you're sharing it with the assumption that it's verified, but of course it's not. And it's not an intentional misrepresentation, but it happens because we overtrust or we get information we don't like, as we discussed in the presentation, and we don't believe it because we undertrust. And part of why I focus so much on humility and vulnerability is because that's an us thing, right? That's I can't figure out what to do with this. And sitting with yourself and what you're scared about and why you're scared about it, I would say is the best starting place for there, though it's certainly not the only one. You want to say anything, Brian?
I would also say that part of the reason that we're so concerned about being manipulated is that language doesn't present us with the opportunity to know when it's a truth or when it's a lie. Its very function is such that it is flexible, and that we can use all the same words to say one thing that is completely true and one thing that is completely false. And that frightens us a bit, right? Because it is a public thing often, where we are out in public and somebody's language convinces us of something, and then we're embarrassed for believing in it or practicing it. As far as a solution for that is concerned, I would say one of the things that we need to get better at as a world is admitting when we're wrong. failing to admit that we're wrong at things reminds people that being wrong is a sign of your own stupidity, is a sign of how weak you are, is a sign of whatever. If we constantly blame other people for our things, then we dig ourselves further into our own beliefs. Whereas if we can say, maybe I'm wrong as a starting place, if we can assume in some positions that where I start and where you start, we are equally possible, there's an equal possibility of our own incorrectness, and then we work it out together, we are in some better shape as far as kind of getting there. And I think that starts to address the question that Alyssa asked about if somebody doesn't believe in these things and they aren't uneducated, they're not done, then how do we reach them? Which echoes a conversation in the chat that says, how do we use language to come together and not be polarizing in our views? The hard part of that is, as much as it is language, it's also just a willingness to get punched kind of verbally over and over again and hear what people have to say, even when it doesn't match up with what we see as reason or logic or truth. The easier part is to identify linguistically, if we're talking about a sort of tool we can use, it's to identify where they are intelligent, where we find common ground with intelligence. Jess pointed out, and this has been a long argument of mine, the sort of false binary that dictates so much of what we're doing. School boards in the area recently have conversations about things like, do we teach race in this way or this way? The presumption there is that there's only two possibilities. That binary immediately creates conflict. What we should be doing instead, where we can, is saying, okay, so you believe in this thing and I believe in this thing, and they're pretty close. Once we've established what that is, we can talk about where we diverge. The hardest part is, I think on some levels, we are all overworked. We are all busy. We are all exhausted. We're tired of these Zoom meetings. I censored myself, Reg. You're welcome. We're tired of these Zoom meetings, and we just want to kind of have quick conversations and convince the people who don't agree with us. It's not going to happen like that. Maybe 80 conversations later, you made a little headway.
Yeah, and I think to the other half of that larger comment, over-identifying with a cause or belief that prevents us from knowing things. How do we create a space safe enough to welcome uncertainty and admitting that we just don't know? All of these things require patience, like a tremendous amount of patience, right? That you let yourself be wrong, but also that you let someone else disagree with you and you don't immediately jump to the attack, but that you can sit with that disagreement. And it is emotionally trying at times. It is emotionally exhausting, and work to understand together. Now, for that to happen, in the same way that in order to use language to come together, everybody has to be willing to try. So my rule in class is often any question sincerely asked is fair game, right? Because if you really want to know, then I have almost infinite patience. But if you're just trying to have a fight, if you just enjoy the conflict itself, we're not moving in a direction necessarily. And it's sometimes hard to tell the difference for sure. But if we're patient with each other, if we're willing to be wrong and let other people be wrong, we have this tendency on the internet to decide whether someone is good or not. That terrifies me. That is not a way to engage in ethics. Because we don't know each other. We're just working through language for these easy answers, and ultimately it's about how we feel. It's not about any sort of understanding. So you create a space where you don't attack, you listen, right? You question, but you don't dismiss. You ask for explanation. And in turn, if you are in that space with someone when they present evidence, you listen to them. You don't say, well, I don't trust you and I don't like you, so I'm not going to engage. You get the phone out, you look it up, you see what's there. And then if you're like me, you don't like being wrong and you just have to live with it and nobody's happy.
Let's see here. What is it about conspiracy theories that make them spread so much more quickly and with much less convincing than science? I like that question a lot because it drives at one of the things that I'm very interested in. But the short answer to that is this, and it goes back to what I was saying before about having a difficulty admitting that we're wrong. Any theory, regardless of the theory about whatever happens, is going to have some parts of it that aren't 100% worked out, right? The beauty of conspiracy theories is they're like plants that grow, and this is me demonstrating that I don't know enough about plants to have the rest of this metaphor work, but plants that grow in the cracks that form in concrete and other things. That is, they look for these gaps and then they dig into them, and people are forced to acknowledge that, yes, that one thing doesn't make sense, and then the mind starts spiraling. So there are a couple ways in which conspiracy theories have worked over the years. One, there have been conspiracies. That is to say, there was a conspiracy to kill Lincoln. And because there was a conspiracy to kill Lincoln, lots of people believed there was a conspiracy to kill JFK. And because they believed that, they looked at odd things like the path the bullet took, because we weren't 100% sure of exactly what angle it left at and whether it ricocheted or not. I want to be clear on this. He was killed by, oh my God, the name just escaped my mind. I was about to say John Wilkes Booth, but it's not John Wilkes Booth.
Oswald.
Oswald, thank you. But now it's really hard to believe what I'm about to say. What's essential there is there are enough gaps and cracks that people can go, oh my God, and there's this one video from a different place. And we go, well, there's a video from over there, and there's a strange path that the bullet took. Therefore, it must be this massive conspiracy. Now, the problem with that is what conspiracy theories tend to do is they find the cracks that do make sense, and they fill them in with nonsense. But that nonsense, because it owes no allegiance to the truth, can always answer its own question. Bertrand Russell talked about this. He makes a case for what he calls the teapot in space. He says, beside the moon, there is an enormous teapot floating in space. And when people ask him questions about it, he goes, well, it's invisible. Well, you can't touch it. It doesn't produce heat. And because he doesn't have to prove anything, he can keep giving answers. Right? So if I had to guess what happened to make a group of people believe, and this is something that people do believe, that people like Hillary Clinton worship Satan and eat babies. Anderson Cooper as well as a baby eater. If I had to ask what got there, it started as a low-level conspiracy that people asked questions about, and then the answers kept spiraling. But once you're in it, and once you've identified yourself as a member of a group who believes this conspiracy, any new information is fed back into people who are already willing to believe it. And it cycles on and on and on. That's one of the ways in which conspiracy theories work. Plus, they're really good at using social media to highlight things, show images, create the memes, as Jess talked about.
Yeah, they're fun. They're fun. Who doesn't want to go to Loch Ness? Obviously I do. But so what do you think about the power of short slogans and how they're interpreted? I think of defund the police and how it was a catchy slogan, but even Barack Obama was hesitant, saying that it was the wrong approach. So this actually ties back into Reg's question earlier, because short slogans are always going to be catchier than nuanced conversation, right? A thing that we can chant or say or put on a t-shirt is going to have way more emotional impact than a paper or a book. At the same time, short, catchy slogans, they don't have any nuance. They don't have perspective. They don't have critical awareness. So they can be really useful sometimes, but I would say we should also be really mindful both of how they can be abused and also why they might not convince people.
We're a little bit over time, so can we maybe try to wrap up within, say, the next 5 minutes or so?
We sure can. We only have one question left, so that works. Which is, do either of you or the audience members have examples of ideas that they changed their mind on when they learned more about it? My example is I was very excited about GMOs as a silver bullet for food security when I learned about them in approximately 2000. But as I learned more, I see them as playing a smaller role in the future of food systems. So I would, for my part, I will wrap up with an example of a moment I changed my mind. And I was a junior in college, undergrad. I was in a sociology class. There were more than 100 people. And my sociology teacher was discussing the effect that advertisements, dolls, and representation had on identity creation. And I raised my hand and I very confidently asserted, I played with Barbie dolls and they had no effect on how I think about things. And she looked at me and she said, of course they didn't. That's not how it works. And then she proceeded to put advertisement after advertisement after advertisement up. And this was the overhead on account of how I'm old. And she discussed, when all you see are chunks of bodies, then you start to think of your body in chunks. You think of how you don't like your legs. You think of how you don't like your stomach. You don't think of your body as a whole. When you play with dolls that only look one way, then if you don't look that way, you start to internalize the notion that you don't look the right way. And if you don't look the right way, then it's hard to believe anybody likes the way you look. And there's more there, obviously. But part of what convinced me in that moment was what she discussed were things that I had felt and knew, but had never come across education to explain. And so as she described it, suddenly I had language that allowed me to express something that I'd been wrestling with in myself. And so part of why it changed my mind was, hey, that's me, right? Like, that's my experience you're describing. And it's important that we give it a chance to do that. That I could have run from that moment. I could have been really uncomfortable. I'm very stubborn, so I've been told. But also, it's a moment where because I was willing to listen, I gained an ability to be more self-aware and deal with that part of myself rather than continue to try to ignore it. So that's one example.
The number of times that I'm wrong are far too frequent for me to list here in any way that's that's going to be completely helpful, Sarah. But I would say that, like, if you knew me when I was 16 and you saw me now, it would be fairly obvious that I am an entirely different human being. In the 8th grade, I was told by my 8th grade English teacher that I should avoid all things having to do with English for the rest of my life. And at the time, I thought, yeah, it's fine. I won't need this stupid class or need to know anything about grammar ever. And now I teach grammar classes here. And so a lot has changed, but in a more, I think what you're asking is a more sort of politically charged moment. Where did my opinion change in something more recent and perhaps more dramatic for the rest of the audience? And I would say this, in December, November, when we first started hearing about the coronavirus, I was one of the people that kept saying, it's the flu. It's just the flu. Since then, I'm the guy who wears a mask everywhere because that's the smart thing to do, wear your masks. But at the time, I was hearing the numbers and thinking not much about the numbers and willing to believe the people who were saying it's nothing to be kind of terribly concerned about. 400,000 people dead in America later, it's fairly obvious that it has been something to be concerned about. Because I didn't do the right research, as a lot of people here have been suggesting we need to do. I wanted to go on, and this is a thing that I can't stress enough, that so frequently we make the mistakes we make because we want to go on living the way we're living. Even if we don't fully enjoy our lives, the lure of the status quo is that we don't have to change, and change is hard. And I wanted to keep on living my life the way I was, going to restaurants, enjoying my free time the way I like to enjoy my free time without restrictions. And I was wrong. I've been wrong a lot. That's maybe my most frequent example.
What a great presentation. Thank you so much, both Brian and Jess. I hope that everybody enjoyed it as much as I did. Boy, I miss those lunches. Can't wait until we get post-COVID and able to talk about things again, because this has been really a stimulating conversation. Greatly appreciate both of you, and I'm sure that everybody online has done the same. Just a reminder to everybody, we've got another One Health coming up on the 24th, just a couple of weeks away. That's going to be Ashley Gripper, and she's going to be talking about, well, the presentation is entitled Vision for a Return, Black Food Sovereignty in the Post-Pandemic City. I hope you will join us for that. I'm sure it will be another stimulating conversation. Thank you so much for being here tonight, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.